So, well, CPTI, I want to introduce my good friend, Jean Johnson, and we're going to talk about her, and I got a little preparation, sharing with my class. There you go. You like that?
Yeah,
So,
that's good.
class, this is for class only, and she requested, so do not share the link. It is in my YouTube channel, but it's classified, which means that only those with that address can watch. So there are 8 of you, and I only expect to see 8 viewing. And then after this, hopefully they will have Q&A. This will be the last lecture of our series on Kapenul. And so we start with round of applause.
Lana, Lana.
So Jin Johnson shares the experience in Mission Field, Cambodia. And I'm just sharing bigger, better, faster model. So ingrained in American culture, or much more in Korean culture, especially the faster, faster. We're not the hero of the book that actually I donate several of them to CPTI. So you have access to that in your library, guys. And it's Missionaries Guide for Sharing Christ, not a Culture of Dependency. The whole lecture on Kapenul was on that. So, well, we would like to entertain Noptola's question. And in the Kapenul teaching, we saw how patron-client dynamic between Korean missionaries and Cambodian pastor played out, and it create dependency, and it create the whole kapjil or patronizing culture. Noptola, you ask, teach us not to depend on completely. Then what should we do if our patron, our kap, makes us dependent? Do we tell them we don't want it, or do we get out and do it on our own? And last week, actually, Professor Vecina did an excellent in how he shared his own life of church plant that Korean missionary did. And after 15 years, he took over and he became not dependent church and all that. It was fantastic. So from this point, I want to actually share with, I'm going to ask Jean, in light of all that, and I share with you, and I kind of briefed you on where we're going. These 8 CPTI students are eventually all going to become professors and teachers and teachers of the pastors. And we were kind of grieved that CPTI, Cambodia Presbyterian Theological Institute, planted something like 150 churches, but not hardly any churches are financially independent. They're all still dependent. And so we're asking the big question. Well, there is an example like Vichina, but he's not part of the CPTI. He was just part of the Korean group. And so in your experience in Cambodia, because you're fluent in Khmer, fluent in Cambodian culture, and your church plant experience, share with our students what you had to go through and how you overcame some of these obstacles.
Okay. Yes, so my church planning experience, I'd say that after being in, there's things that I did that I would do again. And there's things that I did that I would never do again. Okay. So, and at the end of the day, I did plant a church in the capital city of Cambodia that is financially independent and is led by Cambodian leadership. But for me, there's things that I did that led to that for sure. And there's things that I would do differently. So I'm saying the same thing over and over here. So the thing is, when you think of patron-client, in the sense of patron-client, I know that America doesn't even have that terminology per se, but we still come as Westerners, my book, We Are Not the Hero, Americans are taught from when they're small all the way till they're an adult that we are to fix things, that we are to be the hero, that we are to solve all the problems of the world. And so when we are missionaries and we go to another country, that's in our worldview, that's in our framework, that's in our mindset. And what I did in Cambodia along with the other missionaries is basically, this is how I would tell my story. So first of all, before I came to Cambodia, I already spoke Cambodian language. I lived with Cambodian family in the Twin Cities in a place called Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the United States. And so I knew the language, I knew some of the culture, and I went to Cambodia, and within 1 month of my time in Cambodia, I started to plant a church. So that's the first thing that I would do different. The first thing I would do, no matter how much language I knew, no matter how much of the culture I knew because of living with a Cambodian refugee family in the United States, I still have taken 2 years or more to do nothing but learn the culture and even more of the language before doing something formal in ministry. Because with that, it's interesting. I was just writing something recently, and I'm just going to share it with you because it really fits this situation. A missionary teacher named Donald Larson, and he says that cross-cultural workers tend to approach their work as a teacher in a schoolroom, as a seller in a market, and as a judge in a courtroom. Okay, so this is what he means by that, a teacher in a schoolroom. Well, I've only been in your country for 2 weeks now, but I've come here to teach you things before I've even learned anything from you in your culture. I'm brand new, never lived in your country, but here I am, I'm going to teach you things before I've even learned anything from you. So that's the teacher in a schoolroom. And then a seller in the market, it's not that we're trying to sell our religion or sell our faith, but we are trying to share it with people and say, take this as your primary faith. So he says, as a seller in the market, it's kind of like I say to you, oh, I've come to sell to convince you to choose my faith and my beliefs apart from all the others before I've even traded language or life or understanding with you. So I'm already showing up. I've only been there a month. I know nothing about you as a people, but I'm already selling you, trying to convince you that my faith is the right one. And your hundreds of years of folk Buddhism or your religion is not the right one. So that's a pretty strong thing to do when you've only been in the country for a month. And then the second one says a judge in a court. And that's kind of like, I've come here to judge you by showing you how you've missed out on the truth all these years before I have learned what the Cambodians value and believe. Okay, so the role that we take is a teacher in a classroom. We become a seller in the market and a judge in a courtroom before we've ever barely been in the country. So I did that because I thought that's how I should go about it. I'm ready, I'm equipped, I will teach, I will be the spiritual leader, advisor of Cambodians, and I will let them know that that Jesus, the way, the truth, and the light, and all they've known all those years is not truth. But the better roles to replace that, he suggests, is to replace it with learner, trader, and storyteller. So a learner, instead of a teacher, become a teacher in a country I never lived, where I know nothing about. I should become a learner first and spend time learning and understanding everything I can about Cambodia. And then a trader is where we trade information. Tell me about your values. These are my values, but I'm not sure my values work in Cambodia. What are your values? And then they start to tell me their values. And then as storytellers, that's when we begin to exchange stories. You know, this is the story of God. This is the story of creation. This is the story of Jesus coming to earth, you know, fully God and fully man. And so in Cambodia, I basically did not start out as a learner, trader, storyteller. I started out as a school teacher. I started out as the seller in the market and a judge in the courtroom. So all that to say, if you think of Jesus, he spent 30 years learning to be a Jewish man before he started formal ministry, before he started his work as the Savior of the Lord. He was a carpenter, a learner for 30 years. But when he did those 3 years, you know, the question that we can ask ourselves is, how long did Jesus spend training leaders that were capable and equipped to carry on his work without him? Basically 3 years. So, you know, even as Cambodian pastors, I think it's important to ask those questions like, well, let's go to the Bible. How long did it take Jesus to train leaders in a way where he could say, now it's your turn, and I'm going to walk away, not only walk away, but in Jesus' case, die, and then go resurrect to heaven? Those disciples were quite capable in 3 years' time. So what was in Jesus' mindset? What was in his model, in his approach, where he could start missions, start making disciples in such a way that 3 years later, they were capable. They had the vision, they had the passion, they had the ability, they had the sacrificial attitude to carry it on. And so one thing that, you know, you've heard me say, Bob, is that, or if I should, the patron-client culture, I should say, Professor Robert, but I'm so familiar with you as a friend. So, but is a concept called day one affects day 100. So whatever I do as a missionary, a cross-cultural communicator, whatever you do as a Cambodian church planter, whatever you do on day one, down the road will either enhance or inhibit those you are discipling and training to be the ones, to be the disciple makers and the teachers and the trainers. So whatever you do will either help that or inhibit that. Okay. So let me give you an example, because you asked about my church planning strategy. One thing that I did that I would not do again on my day one, that made it difficult for Cambodians to be the ones to shine, to be their own champions, to carry their own responsibility, to be the leaders of the kingdom of God and the church of Jesus in their context, is that, and the missionaries that came in the 90s with me, is that we conceptualized and organized what the church should look like in Cambodia based on our Western American standard of living, the resources that we have in our own country, and our church experience in our culture. Okay. So we got busy doing that. We conceptualized and organized the mission task, not based on the Cambodian culture, not based on the resources that could be cultivated in Cambodia, not based on the indigenous, beautiful culture of Cambodia and the way they might worship, the way they might love a neighbor, but based on us. So 7 years into that kind of mission work, this is where my changing process changed, is 7 years into doing missions like that, we all built what I call these boxes, non-sustainable boxes. Okay. So we took missions, which I believe basically, if you take it out of Matthew chapter 28, and Jesus said, go to all the nations and do what? Make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teach them everything I have commanded or everything I have taught you. So if missions is that, where I go, I share with Cambodians who do not know the Lord, to the point they believe, to the point they want to be baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. My next role is to teach them everything that Jesus commanded. Some of Jesus' commands are love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus taught people how to pray. There's praise or worship. There's break bread or break rice, break rice together. And so we taught those things. And in and of themselves, those things are very simple: to pray, to worship, to love your neighbor as yourself. But we dressed it up in the American or Western or Korean way of doing those things. And so in our box, we put buildings, we put generators, we put, I could go on hundreds of things into the box that we say you need to obey Christ's commands, that you need to be a church, which costs, you fill up this big box and then you think to yourself, wow, this costs a lot of money to do church this way. It costs a lot of money to love your neighbor this way. It costs a lot of money to worship this way. Well, the Cambodians can't do it this way. It's beyond their reach. It's beyond their economic level. It's beyond their culture. These are things that aren't even in the Bible, but from our culture. So what we'll do is we'll pay for it for now. We'll cover the expenses for all of this massive box of stuff you need to do church. And so we did. And we told ourselves that when the Cambodian church grows, they will say, no, we'll do it. We'll take responsibility. We'll pay for all these things. This is our church. We want to lead it. And then we'll slowly pull away our resources and our money, and we will have withdrawn gracefully, and they will be the leaders of their church. But the problem is why we're paying and saying we're in some future time, we will wean away our funding and they will grow up in their giving and their sacrificial giving. We're building the boxes bigger and bigger and faster, and the Assemblies of God is building a box. The Presbyterians are building a box. The Baptists are building a box. You have hundreds of these boxes. And what's happening is the Cambodian church can't grow as fast as we are making it grow. So there's not sustainability planned in. There's no what you would call what's the word I'm looking for? Scalability. We didn't scale the church to their growth. We scaled the church to our growth. We scaled the church to our vision. We scaled the church to our finances we bring out of our country to make it happen. So we did it too fast, and the Cambodians were like trying to catch up and they couldn't catch up. So you have all of these boxes. Basically, everything was in the early years when my approach, we were paying for a lot of things. And then remember, I know the Cambodians remember it well, but there was a coup in 1997. And that coup was bad enough that foreigners and most of the missionaries were evacuated. And so we're gone almost overnight. Well, this was a wake-up call for me, Jean Johnson, because I said to myself, if I cannot go back to Cambodia, if I cannot be physically present, if I cannot bring the resources from my country to do what I was doing, will the Cambodians be able to perpetuate and continue, and not only continue to grow something and add to it, but multiply it, to take what church they have and that church reproduces more churches? I realized that no, not a lot of what I had done or the missionaries had done would the Cambodians be able to sustain it, perpetuate it, and multiply it, because we dreamed up a church that looked like America and not like Cambodia. And so when I came back into the country, I asked God, I said, show me everything I'm doing that the Cambodians won't be able to easily, readily, passionately, contextually be able to do themselves. Okay. So the church that I planted, a couple things that I did differently is that I tried things that it's a complex question. So, for example, what I recommend now is that, and I've taught you this before, Robert, about just the difference between, I'll just say the difference between form and the difference between, let's just take action, okay, or a command of Christ. So I can come to Cambodia and open the Word of God and say, I would love to pass on to you prayer. Okay. I want to pass on to you prayer. Let's look into the scriptures. That how did Jesus teach on prayer? How he commanded prayer. He said, pray like this. Let's just look through the scripture and see what prayer is all about in the Word of God. But usually what I would tend to do in that case is, okay, now I'm going to model prayer. But when I would model prayer, it was based on my culture, not necessarily the Bible. And if I modeled prayer, it was usually something that you could do easily, readily, passionately in my country, but not so easy, readily, passionately, contextually for the Cambodians. So what I would do different now is say, you've just learned about prayer. Now, along with the Bible, the Holy Spirit, more prayer, and your Cambodian peers, why don't you come together for however many weeks or months it takes and ask yourselves, what should prayer look like in Cambodia? See, if you ask me, according to America, we need to build a big center. We need to have a prayer retreat place that costs millions of dollars to build. And then that means that I can do it, but the Cambodians can't do it, that they'll always need me to do it. And so my approach would be to say, what will it look like for you? And it might look like gathering in homes, or it might look like gathering in public established community Cambodian buildings or things like that. But yeah, so again, even with in a country in Africa, the people in that particular country were not giving. Those local people were not giving to their church. They were not giving to support their leaders. So one day, this man who was a believer, a Christ follower, he would be in church all the time, but would never give. And the pastor asked him one day, he said, you're a devoted, committed follower of Jesus Christ, but you never give. And I want to ask you why. And the gentleman answered, because I cannot fit my cow into your offering plate. Okay. So what he was saying is, you pass this plate to collect money and I raise animals. And you have no form for me to raise animals. And so those leaders, they said, our churches are not giving because our form is from the West. But if we were to redesign the offering plate to make the form fit our culture, to be conducive, to make it easy, to make it contextual for our people to give, what would it look like? So they redesigned the offering plate. What they did is build an animal stall, and they built shelves to put produce, mangoes or whatever, your rice, whatever your produce is. And then instead of saying we're only going to give on Sunday, which is another Western idea in saying that you only should come and collect the offerings on Sunday in church, they said you can bring your offering any day of the week. There will be somebody there overseeing the stalls and all of that, because when your first fruits, your first animal is born, You're not going to say, I'm going to wait for a whole week to give this animal on a Sunday. They go straight there and give it. And they found out that this was a way where people could really give. So they changed the form to empower the local people to be the givers. And so a big part of the, equation of what we're talking is to, what I learned in Cambodia is that I'm not going to bring them a Western church so here's an easy way to do it. So let's say you're my friend.
Jean,
And I say, yeah.
Jean, the offering example, is it Cambodia example or another country?
It's in Africa.
Oh, it's in Africa. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So I guess, I feel like, so I could give you for a present, I give you an elephant. Okay, let's say somebody gives me an elephant for a present. And I say, wow, I've always wanted an elephant. Thank you so much. Oh, kuncharan. Damrai la na kyam jangban damrai yun na hai la amen thing. But then I try to feed the elephant. And I realized, wow, this is harder than I thought. This is taking all my resources. I can't feed this elephant day in and day out. I don't want this elephant. This is exhausting. I can't keep up with this elephant. And suddenly what I thought was wonderful and amazing and a gift is a nuisance to me. It's difficult. It's a hardship. It's something I have to strive towards. And I think it's really important in our work as leaders is it doesn't matter if I'm a cross-cultural foreign worker or a Cambodian worker who's from the city, who's going to work in the countryside. We can't give an elephant as a church. We can't give them something that's hard to maintain, expensive, complex, and difficult, and say, here's this beautiful church for you. Here's this amazing gospel of Jesus Christ. And they'll say, oh, good, thank you. And then later they say, this is too hard. This is too difficult. We need to find the person who gave us the elephant and ask them to give us the money to support the elephant. Or we need to ask them to come here and show us how to take care of the elephant. And they can never do it on their own. So Cambodia really needs to sit down and say, where are we giving out elephants? Where are we giving out the biblical Cambodian way style church for a Cambodian context, that they can lead it and sustain it and perpetuate it? So I'll take a breath here and I don't know.
So that's excellent description and point. I think our students are now processing it, because most of my students only had worked with Korean missionaries. So
Okay.
in a way, they do not have anything to compare. So, Bill Privet, my supervisor, came and also did his thing, and he shared his Cambodia experience. So now we begin to see there's a similarities and there's also differences. But in your experience, and when Khmer person realized that I cannot really, because the culture also, because Khmer thinks that pastors are the boss. There's patron is the boss. And in American cultural context, well, boss, I could be friend to my boss, but not in Cambodia, nor in Korea. And so when Korean missionary becomes the boss, they become all of a sudden super God or super this guy with all the authority. And so in your opinion, what is the wisest thing that your followers did to you, or in your relationship with Khmer person? What did you learn, walk away from learning, like, this is what Khmer person can do to American or Korean supervisor or pastor that could really bring them up? Because the whole point is to bring them up to their level. Actually, I'm teaching also a course on this guy, Pastor Bang Ji-il. He lived up to 104 and he published 103 books. You and I go a long way to go. So he was MK. His father was a missionary to China 1920. And his father was, and then he became a missionary to China 1937. When his father finished his 20-year career as a missionary, 1937, he wrote a book saying that the Western missionary, the white missionary, can never become Chinese. The reason, because they cannot scoop down to that low level of economic. And then he said, as a Korean, I live with Chinese and I became Chinese. I became Chinese citizen. My son's Chinese citizen. And then, as you know, that Jonathan Bunk wrote a whole thesis on how it is not possible for Western missionary to become. And so they kind of gave up on that idea. And I realized too that it is no way I cannot live like in the Battambang somewhere. And so maybe we need a happy middle ground. We need to lift up Kamai and we need to step down a little bit, you know. And so in your understanding and your experience in Cambodia, when was last you live here until, so run down your little history. So you came what year? 1990?
1992.
Okay. And then you lived and then you left. And so in your, what year did you leave Cambodia?
2009.
Wow. So that's a long time. Okay.
Yes.
So in your cross-cultural experience, what would you suggest? I mean, the whole point is to teach. I want to empower these young pastors. What would you tell these young pastors how they need to proactively do something? They cannot just take, okay, that's how they're gonna be. So I'm gonna, you know, he's the boss, and I'm not gonna just be a client. What do you suggest? What should you think that they need to do? What's their part?
You know, I thought about this last night, and I was thinking about other countries which are many. Cambodia is not alone. Many countries have faced the same situation, even where you would say subtly patron-client cultures are still in this condition or syndrome or situation where the missionaries who came to start and plant are paternalistic and have carried out their work in such a way that the churches on the receiving end of missions are kind of struggling and weak and trying to handle the elephant, so to speak. It's nothing new. And so when I traveled beyond Cambodia, and so I know I know Africa is not the same as Cambodia. Okay, I understand that, but there are some similarities. And the church in Africa has been there. The church that came through Western missions, it's been in Africa way longer than Cambodia. And yet the Africans are still asking the same question that Cambodian Christian leaders are asking. How do we take responsibility? How do we recover ourselves, our best self-identity? And so when I was in Africa, I met a man who just died recently. His name is Dr. John or Reverend John Gatu. He's an East African. And I wanted to just share with you, because I think it's important to compare or hear a story of a group of people who are struggling with the same thing and what they did and what they talked about. And I'm not suggesting, I'm just giving you some insight of their struggle. So I want to preface it a little bit as I share this with you. This is what they call a strategy for self-reliance, okay? And I know that people don't like the word self-reliance because it talks about independence and individualism. Call it whatever you want, local reliance, Cambodian reliance, Cambodian interdependence reliance, you know, the semantics is important to me, but a strategy for self-reliance in East Africa. This means the East African church was in the same place that Cambodia is and asking the same questions. How can we grow up? How can we have our own voice? How can we have our own vision and our own plans and take responsibility for who we are? And so there's this man, and his name, he was the general secretary of the Presbyterian Church of East Africa. Again, his name is John Gatu. And then there's also the All Africa Conference churches in that area also that had some of the similar thinking and challenge, like what should we do? And I want to reference, before I share the story, I want to reference one article that I read to prepare for this, just to remind me of more of the details. The missionary, the man who wrote this, his name is Michael Cassidy, and he's the founder of African Enterprise. And he was in South Africa, and he was involved in evangelism, teaching, and leadership ministries all the way from 1962. So here's the problem. I'm going to lay it out for you. Here's their problem. For far too long, the church in East Africa and Africa was dependent on the West, not Koreans at that time, because Korea's missionary history is much shorter. And they basically were saying they were dependent on the West, not just in financial matters, but in structures, in their decisions, in their outreach, in their theology. They were dependent on all these things. And so they began to talk among themselves and say, there's another really well-known African leader named John Mbiti. And he said, this is how he said it. He said, their dependence on Western Christianity, or on the West, or on Western missionaries and agencies, meant that their church has failed to use and develop its own resources, their own vision, their own people resources, their own financial and material resources in looking to their own African future. And they compared their African church to this illustration. They said the church in Africa has become like a toothless child who takes the food from the mother, who pre-chews it up because the child doesn't have teeth. The mother with the teeth chews up the food and then gives it to the child so the child can eat it. And they compared their situation. They said, our church has become like a toothless child who eats pre-chewed food from its mother's mouth. This will not do. We must chew the food for ourselves with our own teeth, okay? So that's how they were explaining their situation. Now it's up to the Cambodian leaders to decide, does that description fit them or not? My belief is that to some degree, that description fits what's going on in Cambodia. So the first thing that happened with these East African leaders is they recognized, this is our condition. We are meager, we are weak, we are not rising up to God's best version of ourselves in our context to take our responsibility. So first they recognized that and became dissatisfied that, not a holy dissatisfaction. Okay? There's a difference between holy dissatisfaction. Now this is just my words, okay? There's a difference between holy dissatisfaction and what I would say just a very earthly dissatisfaction. A holy dissatisfaction is like Nehemiah in the Old Testament, when they came and told him, the city gates of Jerusalem are in ruins. Everything is ruined. And Nehemiah went to God and he prayed and he said, God, having the wall of Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem in ruins is not who we are meant to be. We are meant to be leaders. We are meant to have vision and to have healthy pride in ourselves. And so that's what I would call like a holy dissatisfaction. So what did Nehemiah do? He said, oh, well, whatever, let the city lie in ruins. I'm just going to do my thing. He said, no, I'm going to go there and do something about it. Okay. But earthly dissatisfaction is something like, those people have cheated us, they have ruined us, they're no good, we should get rid of them. That's not the posture or the motive that I'm talking about. So with these East Africans, it wasn't that they were angry or wanted to ruin the missionaries or destroy their lives or pay them back, but they had a holy dissatisfaction with the current situation. So they decided to ask, this is what they did. Okay? Now, I'm just telling the story. So they decided to ask the missionaries to give them some space, to stop the flow of both the missionary personnel and funds coming at them. Give them temporary space. For them, that meant 3 years. But the point was, it was just temporary. Just give us some breathing room, some space. And the reason, the why, the motive behind it is to give them some space, meaning stop the flow of all the money coming at us and all the ideas from the outside, and give us space to shape our own selfhood. And what that meant is that so they could shape their own way of being God's church and disciples in a biblical and African way in an African context. And so they came up with, this is the list of 4 reasons why they wanted the missionaries to give them room. And I think these are really helpful to your students. 1, they wanted to discover an authentic African form of Christianity, which can in turn enrich all the Christian churches of the world. So not only did they want to heal themselves, grow up, chew their own food, but they wanted to get healthy so they could in turn influence the Koreans and influence the Americans, because they believed within them that they had something to offer. And in Cambodia, if you have a patron client where you kind of feel like, we're just going to take it, this is how it always is, we're just going to lay down in it, I would challenge you to say, you have something to teach me. You have so much to teach me. And you need to believe in yourselves, believe that I could sit before your feet for 2 years without saying a word, and I would walk away being an enriched Christian. The second idea that they came up with was to encourage African churches to leave the dependent attitudes many of them had adopted. So they didn't say, we're going to go change the missionaries. They knew they could change the missionaries. They decided that the solution was with them, that they couldn't go and change the mindset of all of these missionaries that have been ingrained in their minds and culture, but they decided, let's start with ourselves. Let's encourage African churches to leave our dependent attitudes that we've adopted. And I'm not talking about leaving patron-client culture. That is part of Cambodian culture. It's the dependent attitudes that grew up from the way we gave them missions, patterns that we created. I mean, can you imagine? I'm veering off for a moment, but can you imagine being a Cambodian and you've never heard of Jesus, you don't know anything about Christianity, you've been a folk Buddhist all your life, and all of a sudden these missionaries come with this good news, with this completely different faith system. You know nothing about it, and they start to set up missions, however that looks to them. How am I as a Cambodian supposed to discern this is their culture and this is the Bible? No way, I've never even heard of Jesus. So how am I supposed to, at never knowing any of those things, begin to discern what to keep and what to throw out, what to retain, what to not do? I assume that everything a missionary does is from the Bible. Why wouldn't it be? But it's not. So you just say, oh, they put up a building 2 days after they've been in the country. That's normal. That must be how it's supposed to be done. Oh, that's how Christianity works. The people who bring us Christianity pay for everything. Oh, that's how it works. That's normal. Well, it's not normal, but it would become normal, because how can a Cambodian begin to discern what is normal and not normal? If a Cambodian Buddhist came to my country and started doing certain things, some might be Buddhist and some might be just culture. I can't discern. I would assume everything they did came straight out of the Buddhist teaching or Buddhist teaching. But anyway, the third thing they said is to help African churches establish their own priorities in their work for Christ and to become fully missionary churches themselves. So they wanted to establish their own priorities. And then the fourth one, to enable the traditionally missionary sending churches in the other lands. So these are the missionary sending churches like from Korea and the West, to take space and actually examine the nature of their mission and their future partnership with other churches. So in honesty, they were creating most of the space for themselves to change. But they said this will give the missionaries some time for them to think and evaluate how they want to approach missions in our land. And maybe when we're both healthy, we come back together and we can do what you said, meet in the middle. But it's really hard to meet in the middle when it's all broken to begin with. But some of the things they did in practicality is, so one thing they did is, as leaders, as African leaders, which you could do this very, very well in Cambodia, step aside and say, what should church look like for Cambodians in a way that's not an elephant, but that is sustainable for us, is reproducible for us, is contextual for us, and let's promote and do that kind of church. You will never be self-responsible, you will never be sustainable if you continue to try to do a model of church that is from another country, that does not match your standard of living, that does not match the magnificent resources that you have in your own country. It'd always be like carrying an elephant. So if Cambodians want to be the leaders and want to sustain, you need to come together and talk and say, what would church look like for us so that it is doable and reachable? And then they went from home to home and taught the African Christians, at least in East Kenya, of what it would be like if everyone gave, if they gave sacrificially, if they gave their resources, just like in the Bible, give your first fruits, and in an African way or a Cambodian way, and then told everybody, if our Cambodian churches, in their case, if our African churches could be in unity, what would it look like? We could do anything together. There's a story about a bird, there's a story about a hunter and a bunch of birds, okay? So these birds, a hunter kept coming and throwing, and he would hide and he'd wait for the birds to come, and the birds would come together and flock together and they'd be eating. And the hunter would take a big net and he'd throw it over the birds and he'd capture them. And this would happen again and again. And the birds were getting weary and tired because the hunter was so powerful and he was so dominant and he was always catching them in his net. And one of the birds said to the other birds, you know what? I have a plan. We're not going to allow this to happen anymore. There's a lot of us. There's only one hunter. There's 20 of us. Why is the hunter stronger than us? What we need to do is when he throws the net over the top of us, I will count 1, 2, 3. And when I say 3, we will all flap our wings together at one time. And so the hunter came. He hid behind a tree. When he saw the birds come, he repeated his sickly pattern of being dominant and paternalistic and threw his net over the birds. And the wise bird said, now, muy, bi, mai. They started to flap their wings and all of them worked together and the net began to lift up. They began to raise into the air, and the net was over them, and they got high enough, flew over to a tree, got above a branch, flew out under from the net landed in the branch of the tree, and they were free. And the moral of the story is, you can do just about anything if you work together. So if the Cambodian church wants to be self-reliant and self-conscious and self-determined, okay, or local determined, Cambodian reliant, and all those things, when the vacuum happens, when the missionaries are not able to do everything and anything, who will the Cambodians need to rely on if they can't rely on the missionaries? They will begin to rely on one another. Pastor Sophia from Church A can go to Pastor Peck in Church B and say, this is what my church knows how to do. How about your church? Do you know how to do something we don't know how to do? Wow, you really do know how to write your own worship. Could you teach us how to write worship? Yes, we could do that for you. What do you know how to do what we don't know how to do? Well, we know how to take care of orphans in a Cambodian way, where we've adopted an orphan, and one family feeds the orphan breakfast, another family feeds the orphan lunch, and another family in our church feeds the orphan dinner. And that orphan gets a meal 3 times a day. And that's how we do it. We could do that. That's something we could do. And so what happens is, when there's a vacuum of foreign, overtly too much foreign presence, the Cambodians can learn to become what we call local interdependent, rather than just globally dependent. It's very difficult for Cambodian churches to learn to share their resources and work together when global interdependence is stronger than local interdependence. So what I challenge the Cambodian leaders that in your class is to say, how can we become locally interdependent? How can all of our churches in Battambang already come together and plan together what will happen if there's a flood? How can we, in every culture there are what I call, you remember the story of Boaz and Ruth? Ruth and Naomi were hungry. Ruth and Naomi were refugees. They had to flee. They came, well, at least Naomi was. They came back to their country after there was the famine was over, and they had nothing. No husband, they were a widow. And Boaz, a man in the society and in their extended family system who was a little bit wealthier. He had fields to harvest. And it was that Boaz was of their culture, and Boaz helped Naomi, someone of his culture. They didn't pass, just pass out a bunch of free stuff. With dignity, they let stuff fall as they gleaned through the field, so that those who were poor could pick it up. And they picked it up, and they had dignity because it wasn't a handout, but it was a help. It was a help, but it wasn't a handout. And they did the work, and they picked it up, and they felt good about themselves. Cambodia, every culture, Africa, Cambodia, they have their own Boazes and their own Naomis. And what about all the Boazes in Cambodia? The dentists, the Cambodian doctors that are Christians come together and say, how can we, as the Cambodian Boazes of our culture, help our Naomis of our culture? So there's so many opportunities. If you like the African group, they became wholly dissatisfaction with the condition they were in. Instead of saying it's somebody's fault or those people should fix it, they said to themselves, we need to start to fix it by ourselves, through ourselves. It's our problem, our responsibility for now. And so they came up with a way to do that, not in a mean way, not in a way to come against the missionaries or say there's no room for us, but did ask them who they were, those missionaries who were working with them in the Presbyterian Church agency, could you just give us room here and let us have some time to figure out ourselves, right? And figure out what we should look like as a church and help build ourselves back up. And then let's renegotiate what partnership could look like. But it's really hard for us to be in partnership when it's not really partnership, because in a marriage, there's give and take. But partnership isn't, I pay for everything, you never, partnership is when you give and take from one another. Not where the person, the patron just gives. So I just thought I'd share that story because I think it wasn't easy and it was messy, I'm not gonna lie. But that Presbyterian group did become self-sustaining for however many years. I don't know if it stuck until the next generation and the next generation, and when missionaries started kind of bombarding them again. But yeah, that's just, I think, some practical ideas of how to really approach it.
Wow. Thank you, Jean. That really, I think, will speak to them because they really are in leadership group, next generation leadership group. And I was mentioning, and I'll be briefly talking about tomorrow morning about how Christianity began at the refugee camp, and that really brought the whole dependency issue, and so the whole generation of refugee camp generation really must go, and and then we cannot continue that. So I was challenging the young leaders, don't let refugee camp spirituality continue in your generation because you're not refugees. And so, well, thank you so much, Jean. Actually, Jenny wants to say hi to you, so don't turn off. So
okay, yeah.
We'll say goodbye to our students.
Okay,
for now. Hey, Jean, you'll be nice. Can you actually pray for them in Khmer, and so that they will be blessed, and then we'll end the meeting. Pray for them in Khmer, if you could.
Okay, sure. Okay. I'll bear Chimacha. Tubungkum Atitan. Iloni, Knang Prenium Pramacha Jesu Christ. Simrab Net Dak Norm, Krugong Will Khmer. Don't throat Khmer. Tubungkum Som Prechicha. Protein away thing off. Dial Bouquet Troka. ដើម្បីបម្រើព្រះជាម្ចាស់ដោយអស់កម្លាំងអស់គំនិតអស់ចិត្តរបស់អ្នកដឹកនាំខ្មែរនេះទូលគុំយល់ហើយបញ្ហានៅទីនេះធំណាស់មិនស្រួលទេសូមព្រះយេស៊ូវដែលជាគំរូល្អសម្រាប់យើងឲ្យយើងចេះធ្វើដែរតើយើងត្រូវធ្វើអីដើម្បីបង្ហាត់បង្រៀនដោយព្រះយេស៊ូវបង្ហាត់បង្រៀនហើយក្នុងអស់រយៈពេល3ឆ្នាំព្រះយេស៊ូវបានបែកចេញពីពួកសាវករបស់ព្រះយេស៊ូវហើយពួកសាវកនោះធ្វើបានដោយខ្លួនឯងព្រះយេស៊ូវសូមធ្វើការអស្ចារ្យនេះនៅស្រុកខ្មែរសូមបំពេញស្រុកខ្មែរដោយអ្នកដឹកនាំនិងអ្នកជឿតាមព្រះយេស៊ូវដោយព្រះចេស្តានិងអំណាចរបស់ព្រះយេស៊ូវទូលបង្គំអធិដ្ឋានក្នុងព្រះនាមព្រះអម្ចាស់យេស៊ូវគ្រីស្ទ Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Jean.
It's been about 10 years, since I've spoken Cambodian. I feel very...
You sound great because I don't speak Khmer, so you sound great.
My language. Oh, wow.